Capes on the Couch podcast is for entertainment purposes only. Dr. Issues is a psychiatrist, but he is not your psychiatrist and does not have knowledge of your individual situation. For any personal mental health concerns, please consult your own healthcare providers. For medical emergencies, please call 911 or the designated number in your area immediately. Remember that you are not alone and help is out there.
Hello, welcome to Capes on the Couch, where comics need counseling. I'm Anthony Sitko. Here's Dr. Issues.
Hello, everyone. And no, we're not superstitious, so we are not skipping episode 13.
No, this is number 13. As always, you can find our show on our website, capesonthecouch.live. We are distributed through the Libsyn network. You can find the show on Google Play, iTunes, Stitcher, TuneIn, YouTube, and iHeartRadio. We have a Patreon page, patreon.com/capesonthecouch, where you can subscribe to the show at the $1, $3, $5, and $10 levels. So you can get a shout out for the $1. At $3, you get early access and a monthly blooper reel. $5 gets you a longer, uncensored episode or skit every week. Plus, you guarantee that any questions you have will be answered. And at $10 a month, if you're the president, you can pick one character every month, and we will do that character and answer any questions that you have about that character. Talk about anything you want. You basically dictate the episode, and we will kind of run it the way that you want it to be run. So next week is actually our first president-picked episode. We're going to do Legion in honor of Brian. Long may he reign for buying us this fantastic equipment.
All hail Brian.
All hail Brian, yes.
Brian is life.
Brian is love. Brian is life. Much like Shrek. And we got a Facebook page and a Twitter, Capes on the Couch, and you can email us at capesonthecouch@gmail.com. So we ask that you like, subscribe, leave a positive review for the show on whatever platform you choose to hear our melodious voices deal with you on every Wednesday at 8 a.m. when these episodes come out. So, Cyclops, Scott Summers. He is the focus of this week's episode, and I think South Park said it best. Scott is a dick.
Yep. You know, wait. Before we go too far with that, I have to say, when I first started, researching the character, I thought, man, this guy's a real jerk. But when you get more into it and really see how he evolves over time, you realize he's still a jerk. It's incredible. Huh.
God, you're such a dick, Scott. Another South Park reference. It seems like every episode we could do at least one South Park reference, but I don't want to belabor the point too much. So Cyclops, obviously one of the most iconic members of the X-Men, of the Marvel Universe, I think in general. A very long-standing character, has a lot of issues, and I don't mean that in a necessarily pejorative sense, but appears in a lot of issues of comics, both X-Men and X-Men adjacent and even non-X-Men comics. So let's get into as much as we can of his backstory without running, into an hour and a half long episode. So Scott Summers, Cyclops, was created by Stan Lee and Jack Kirby and was in the first X-Men, September 1963. He was one of the original students of Charles Xavier, and he is a mutant who can fire energy beams from his eyes. So he's forced to wear a ruby quartz visor to keep his blasts contained at all times. So as one of the original students of Xavier, he eventually becomes the leader of the X-Men in Xavier's absence, and later, after Xavier dies, we'll get into that. That carries a lot of burden and responsibility on his shoulders. We later discover his father is Christopher Summers, a.k.a. Corsair, and leader of the Starjammers, and we're really not going to get into that. His younger brother, Alex, becomes Havok, and he can fire energy blasts from his body. He becomes romantically involved with Jean Grey, another one of the original X-Men, Marvel Girl, Jean Grey, Phoenix. Again, we could do an entire episode just on Jean, and I think we have her planned for a later time. So after the original team, the original five, which was Cyclops, Jean, Beast, Iceman, and Angel, those are the original five X-Men. After the original team is defeated by Krakoa, he trains the new group of X-Men, and this is Storm and Nightcrawler and Wolverine and, the giant size X-Men from like 1973, 74, whenever that was, that very famous, new X-Men issue. After the Phoenix saga, we're really not going to get into that. Everybody knows the Phoenix Saga. Jean Grey dies after, being taken over by the Phoenix Force or becoming the Phoenix, whatever the hell you want to call it. So Scott quits the X-Men because he's heartbroken and he's despondent after the love of his life dies. Then he meets Madeline Pryor, who is a Jean Grey lookalike.
Okay.
She literally looks exactly like Jean Grey.
I mean, I've heard, anyone that's been involved in sports or any team activity, you've heard the term next man up. In this case, this was next woman up. And the turnaround, even in the comics, the turnaround is pretty quick on this. Scott's a player.
Yeah. Well, and we get into that, and I'll mention it, Madeline, sort of where she comes from and everything. So they have, first off, he marries Madeline. They have a child, Nathan, who becomes Cable, who, if you saw Deadpool 2, and I did, it's absolutely hilarious. I was a little sad, and I don't think this is much of a spoiler. They don't get too much into Cable's family, which kind of disappointed me because I felt like, especially in a film like Deadpool, you could really have a lot of fun with the fourth wall breaking and mentioning just how incredibly convoluted Cable's backstory is. It seemed to me to be prime opportunity for a joke, and it was a missed opportunity by the Deadpool writers, but I digress. So Jean comes back because it's Jean Grey, and this is what she does. She dies and comes back. So Scott leaves his family to be with her because he doesn't, never mind, he's got a wife and child. He's going to leave them to be with his original, flame. But he returns to kill Mr. Sinister after Sinister drove Madeline to suicide, at which point we discover that she's really a clone of Jean Grey from an alternate dimension, which is why she's an exact lookalike of Jean Grey, because she's literally a clone from another dimension or timeline. I forget exactly what. Don't think too hard about it. Don't put too much thought into it.
Well, thank you for that advice, because I certainly won't.
So then we discover that Cable is actually the time-traveling future son of Scott and Madeline, because he comes from a different dystopian future where he's the son of Scott and the Jean Grey displaced. Please, really, again, don't think about it too much, or you'll give yourself an aneurysm.
Cable is a badass from the future. That's all you need to know.
Yeah, let's just go with that. He's a badass from the future. So he eventually marries Jean because Madeline is dead from suicide. So now he goes back to Jean. So they get married. But then she starts taking over the school. She's helping out with a lot of things. She's headmistress of the school, and Scott feels abandoned. So he goes to Emma Frost, and she does not look like Jean at all. No, Jean's a redhead. Emma's blonde. Jean tends to wear, fairly average looking clothing. I don't think there's an inch of Emma's body that she's not willing to flaunt and or show off. Really, it's just an excuse for the artists to get really, really creative with some fashion choices. I think the greatest superheroes in the Marvel Universe are the fashion designers who come up with Emma Frost clothing, because some of those outfits just do not hold together unless you've got some sort of magic or mutant abilities holding things in place and preventing things from popping out. So Jean dies again because this is what she does. And now Scott is really free to be with Emma. So now he can just be with Emma guilt-free. But not really, because he still kind of thinks about Jean a lot all the time. So he begins to resent Xavier for molding him into the leader as a teen, because he's like, I was a teenager and you should just let me be a teenager. And why'd you hoist all this responsibility on me? Baldy, I hate you. And he leaves the school, because that's how he deals with things. I'm in trouble. I'm just going to run away. I don't know how to process my emotions. We're going to get into this later, but he's just... So House of M, where Scarlet Witch says no more mutants, and there's like 190 something mutants left in the planet after, thousands of them get depowered. Well, Scott is one of the ones who retains his power, but he's one of the only ones. So now he has to help protect the rest of those mutants who did retain their abilities and didn't die. And then we find out that there is a mutant baby born after the incident, and she becomes known as Hope, and Scott gives her to Cable to raise in the future. So now he's giving this baby to his future son from an alternate dimension to raise in another future alternate dimension. Please, folks, don't think about this too hard.
I will say the one thing you want to think about is they used the name Hope for a reason.
Yeah.
Deep stuff. It's amazing. The things that you would think would take a lot more brain processing power, such as how will typical human emotion work its way into long-term comic book writing. That's a serious issue. That gets pushed to the wayside, the use of the name Hope. But you need a PhD to understand comic book timelines.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, we could do an entire episode just on how convoluted the entire Summers family tree and all of its adjacent and associated, characters are. We could just do episodes on that. But I don't want to, because I like living and I like my brain the way that it is, and I don't want to hate myself. So then Avengers versus X-Men comes along, and I know I'm skipping over a bunch of these events, but honestly, because Scott Summers has been involved in myriad events, there's only so many we can mention, as I said, without this turning into like a 2-hour diatribe on how Scott Summers is a dick. So in Avengers versus X-Men, the Phoenix Force returns to Earth because the writers ran out of ideas, and they said, sure, let's bring this back. So apparently it's determined that the Phoenix Force is going to bond with Hope Summers, who's back from the future timeline. I forget where that came from. Scott wants her under the protection of the X-Men. The Avengers feel that because this is a global level threat, as the Phoenix Force always is, they want her under their protection. So this naturally leads to a battle because Scott's a dick. And to be fair, Captain America's kind of a dick too in this series. And I say that having the Captain America shield tattooed on my shoulder blade and worshiping at the altar of Steve Rogers, but he was kind of pig-headed in this, especially the initial confrontation with Cyclops on the beach in the first issue of Avengers versus X-Men. He's just like, nope, we're taking Hope. I don't care what it is. I don't care that she's a mutant. We're coming in. No questions asked.
And I will say, Scott replies in a very, very mature way. He blasts him to oblivion, out in the ocean.
Yep, he blasts Captain America with his I-beams and thus begins a massive multi-issue fight that sprawls numerous side issues and tie-ins. Avengers v X-Men, by the way, I bought every single tie-in issue. Not only did I buy the main 12 issues, I literally went to the comic store each week, and if it was an Avengers v X-Men tie-in, even if it was a book I'd never read before, I read it and I bought it, and I still have a vast majority of them.
All right, so I'm going to ignore your obsessive compulsive personality and going to continue with the information here about Cyclops.
So eventually Cyclops kills Xavier and bonds with the Phoenix Force until Hope absorbs it all, and then they use Wanda's chaos magic to help defeat the Phoenix Force. But this is, again, after Cyclops, under the influence of the Phoenix Force, kills his mentor, Charles Xavier. So Cyclops is captured and imprisoned and eventually joins with Magneto, who helps break him out of prison, and he becomes basically hardened against mankind, and he becomes the, by any means necessary, reactionary that Magneto has always been portrayed as.
Yeah, basically you need to know that Scott becomes Malcolm X, and it shows. They don't really hide this anymore in terms of the relationship of mutants and regular humans and how that's a metaphor and all that. No, it really comes out in the open, and it's written that way.
Yeah, this is basically almost like the protege of Martin Luther King saying nope. And I hate to really boil it down I know a lot of white people tend to view it as, oh, well, Martin Luther King was very peaceful and Malcolm X was a reactionary and they were at loggerheads. They were far more similar, particularly when they were both alive, than we understand and is discussed. But this, again, is just a situation where, the protege of the peaceful one becomes the reactionary. So Magneto and Cyclops say that they're, focusing on everything for the good of mutant kind. So he eventually takes over the school as per Xavier's will. Because Xavier basically left everything to Scott, saying, you were my protege. You are the one who's going to take everything and lead the mutants into the next generation of what have you. And Scott says, you know what? I don't want this responsibility. I'm out. And he hands it over. I think he hands it over to Kitty Pryde, if I'm not mistaken. Uh-huh. I think she's the one who took over the school at this point. Yes. And he kind of begins to realize, I was actually kind of wrong, and maybe I was just being a dick. And then he dies. during the Death of X storyline because the Terrigen Mists come along because Marvel Studios doesn't have the rights to X-Men, so they decide to push the Inhumans on everything. And because of that, Marvel Comics starts pushing aside all the X-Men, and they say, oh, well, guess what? Terrigen Mists are actually toxic to mutants, and because now we're pushing all the Inhumans, and Inhumans are popping up everywhere, this is fatal to mutants, and as a result, Cyclops dies.
Oh, well.
So, and this, again, really scratches the surface. We're talking maybe 10% of all of the storylines that Cyclops is involved in. Like I said, there's so many things we could talk about in addition to this, but we really just don't want to go too long on the backstory and get into some of the issues. So, I mean, I'll let Doc, is there anything else you want to add as far as Scott's background?
Yeah, I'll say this. In terms of why, one of the biggest issues Scott always has is controlling his optic blasts. The original story was that he and his brother were pushed out of a plane, basically told, take the parachute, and we'll see you at some point. By the way, we're going to die. Bye. And they survived. But the original one was that he had head trauma, and that's why he can't control those blasts. The retconned version is that he had so many traumatic experiences in his childhood growing up as basically as a foster child that he purposely lost control of them, and he just doesn't know how to deal with anything. So either way, that gives us plenty of fodder to deal with, but I wanted to make sure I brought that out right from the start. So,
yeah, I was going to say, I forgot to mention his parents were killed in a plane crash, or so he thought, and we later determined, like I said, that, his father, Christopher, is alive. There's a third Summers brother that was alluded to. I'm not going to get into that because...
Thank God.
Again, the Summers family tree is just fakakta beyond belief, and I don't want to belabor the point too much further. So let's get into the issues of why Scott Summers is a dick. And I know I keep saying that over and over and over again, but he really, really is. He's just a dick. The first thing is he's born to lead, that he had this leadership mantle foisted upon him by Professor X at a young age, as a teenager, as part of the first class of mutants. And this has always kind of been his thing, is that he's the leader. And sometimes it's for a good thing. Sometimes it's for not so good. I remember under Whedon's run, there was the famous scene where the Sentinels were invading the school and Cyclops, basically says, get off my lawn, and obliterates the Sentinels with this massive optic blast. And Wolverine's like, now I remember, that's why you're in charge, because he can do that stuff. Other times it's not so great. And I think it bogs him down and it weighs upon him and it creates problems. So if Doc, you want to expound a little bit on that to start.
Yeah, so you couldn't see it, but when Anthony was saying born to lead, he put that in quotation marks, and I actually asked him to do that. The reason is he was groomed to be a leader, and we see this happen in different parts of society. For people that think of trust fund children or, people that just happen to have certain privileges in life, you just knew that they were going to do great things. Now, that's not to discredit their natural abilities and talents, but they basically get set up where they know that they're going to be in a position of power. So for someone like Scott, especially with his abilities, I mean, that's potentially a good thing. But from the start, what you start seeing with him is in moments where he has to make a split-second decision, it's naturally coming out. So you just gave the best example I could think of. I hadn't even remembered that scene, but it was perfect because he was able to do that in the moment, and he didn't have to think about numerous other scenarios. He wasn't playing chess. He was just making the best decision with the information that he had at that given moment, as opposed to when he has the opportunity to take a step back. Usually, we like to think when you have more information and more time to consider it, that you're going to make better decisions. In general, that can be true. However, for someone like Scott, he suffers from paralysis by analysis. He overthinks it. He tries to come up with every possible scenario and response, and he's playing the game out in his head so much that everybody else is basically waiting around saying, okay, well, but what do we do? And that's going to create problems because people want to act in emergencies. And if you're not actually telling them what they're supposed to be doing in those situations, they're not going to know what to do. They're going to still do what they think is necessary, but it may not be what he wanted, or it may not be what the best decision would have been. And now everybody's going to face the consequences of all of these helter-skelter responses. For example, you have a situation with someone like Captain America coming to you and saying, hey, we got a big deal here. We have this Phoenix Force coming through. We have a child that apparently is supposed to get this stuff. This is bad, and we're going to handle it. Yes, Captain America is doing the same thing that Scott likes to do, which is, okay, well, I'm going to make my decision right now. But that was an opportunity for some level of diplomacy. You could have said, like, okay, you're right. This is huge. We're going to have to really work together and figure this out. We've got the manpower or the mutant power, whatever you want to call it. We have the ability to do all of this together. And instead, it's just, nope, bye. Okay. And then from there, every step that he was trying to take from, okay, let me scatter everybody else. Okay, all of you, go to different parts because whatever we have to do, we have to protect Hope. It's like, yeah, but are you sure that we need to separate? Well, that's, we'll figure it out later, and then you end up with some people end up in horrible fights where they get killed. And then other people that are saying like, well, are you sure this is the way we go? Well, never mind. I got the power now. Okay. I got the Phoenix Force myself. All right. Now I know what we have to do. Like, yeah, but Scott, it's not all you. No. I got it. Don't worry. It's all just this haphazard situation where he's willing to take control in those circumstances, like in the emergency, but because he doesn't know how to gather other people around him for it. I know it's become a positive thing to say lead from the front, but it's more like break stuff and see what happens. And
lead from the front without any concern about what's happening behind him.
Yeah, exactly.
If you're going to lead from the front, you have to at least know what's happening behind you. You have to turn around every once in a while and see what's going on with the rest of your followers, right, army, what have you. Scott doesn't tend to do that. He just, he clears a path with his optic blasts, and then he doesn't see. He's like, all right, I'm going through. Y'all going to follow me, right? Okay, let's go.
Right. And then there are times where he starts to consider that, but rather than saying, okay, I think we're going to have to regroup on our approach here. Okay, I may have made a mistake on a few paths, but I think overall we can salvage this. We can do something a little different. It's more like, oh man, I screwed that up. All right, I'm out of here. Like literally, he just leaves sometimes.
Yeah. He takes his ball and he goes home, and he's like, oh, I can't deal with this responsibility, or I screwed up. I'm such a disappointment. And it's frustrating that you would think that someone who ostensibly was trained and raised by Xavier would have some more level of maturity than just, things didn't go the way I wanted them to. But it tends to be Scott's MO on a number of occasions. And like I said, even in just a handful of incidents that we mentioned that occurs. So there's numerous other instances that we didn't even mention that I can probably say, oh yeah, he also walked away from this. He walked away from that. He fought and then walked away. He takes his ball and he goes home. So that's certainly not a very leader-like thing to do. A leader is supposed to stick with things through thick and thin, and you're there for the good and the bad. You can't just cut and run just because something isn't working for you. Speaking of cutting and running, let's move on to his next big thing. His relationships. We see this happen, it's just like a rotating cycle of Jean, Madeline Pryor, and Emma Frost, and just going from one to the next, to the next, to the next, to the next. And as you said, it's next woman up. Oh, well, he starts off with Jean, which was very well done, and I thought was, very nice. And then she dies, and okay, he's traumatized by that, and I don't think anybody's going to begrudge him that. But then he goes to the lookalike, Madeline Pryor, and then Jean's back, and I'm going to forget about Madeline now. I'm going to go back to my first one. Oh, but Madeline's dead, and now I'm going to be really sad about that, but I'm going to go to Jean, and but Jean isn't loving me enough. I'm going to go to Emma, and then Jean's dead. Oh, now I can really be with Emma, and
I'm going to make it even more complicated because of their psychic abilities, between Jean Grey and Emma. That's what they actually referred to it as. At one point with Emma Frost, they referred to it as a psychic affair. That's just how meta Scott Summers gets.
That's right. Forgot about that.
Yeah. Well, I mean, the main point with this, of course, you don't need to say Scott Summers. You could name any number of people in our own lives where you've seen this type of pattern. I'm not begrudging a person from having a relationship that didn't work out at some point, or is incredibly intense and seems to be working out but has its ups and downs. I mean, that's fine. That's life. But the issue here is that he does it in a way that is almost discarding whoever, was once in his life, and he just like picks them up and drops them and picks them up and drops them. It's
utilitarian.
Yeah, just, you're who I need right now. And there's an old song, if you can't be with the one you love the one you're with. I think he's been living that, or was living that before he died. But it creates a situation where you're not creating a true reciprocal love. You're loving the person for what they can provide, but you're not necessarily giving value back. And I know it's only the juxtaposition because the way we are talking about these characters each week. We just did Victor Freeze. Victor was stuck on one person and he didn't change after that. Scott seems to have this issue where whatever's going on in the moment with a person, that's important to him, but he just kind of discards them once again when things aren't exactly the way that he thought that they were going to be. It's a little unhealthy.
Yeah, it's his take his ball and go home mentality, but with people, but with women and relationships. And it's, oh, well, this isn't working, so I'm just going to move on to the next one and on to the next one and so on and so on. And that's destructive. It's certainly disrespectful to the people who choose to love him. And I don't know. I mean, I'm assuming I know at some point he's going to come back to life. And by the way, I totally forgot. We didn't even mention the fact that the original 5 X-Men were brought from the past into the present. We totally forgot to mention that. Not that I want to belabor that point too much because we're just discussing the adult Scott, but at some point Beast says, things are really messed up here. I need to go back in time and bring the original 5 X-Men back into the present time. So and it's led to some really great stories about, Bobby Drake, Iceman, him coming out, and the young version of Bobby coming out sooner and having an easier time of it, and then forcing the older Bobby to come to terms with all of his suppression of his sexuality. It's made for some really compelling stories. And an instance where they imprisoned the young Jean Grey because of everything that she was going to grow up to be. And so that led to some tussles with the Guardians of the Galaxy. We're not going to belabor that point too much. Suffice to say that there's a struggle there with the young Scott and the old Scott over what the leadership role is. And the young Scott sees the fact that the old Scott has killed Professor Xavier. And that really messes with his head because he's like, what could have possibly driven me to kill my mentor? What happened to me between now and now? To me, I don't know how else to phrase it because of the messed up way in which the Marvel timeline works. But in any event, but that gets brought up as well is the adult Scott talking to young Scott and young Jean about everything that the old Jean meant to the old Scott. I know it doesn't sound like it makes a lot of sense. I'm trying to make it as coherent and cohesive as possible, but that discussion of the relationship, and adult Scott says to young Scott some really nice and wonderful, loving things about the old Jean and the relationship that they had. But by the same token, you wonder, like, how much did you really mean that if you're willing to just leave her for a lookalike and then go back and then you leave her for Emma and then so on and so forth? Getting back to my original point, it does a disservice to the women that he loves and the people that love Scott that he treats them with such, I'm trying to think of the word, but just he discards them, as you said, for lack of a better term. He tosses them away. He just, with no regard whatsoever for their feelings.
I do think a part of it, if anyone has seen the iconic picture of Scott and Jean kissing at their wedding, like that's one of the best panels I think that's ever been done in comic book history.
Yeah.
And I think, and I'll admit this is a projection, people. Well, this is all projection. We're talking about imaginary characters. But that was the moment where they were supposed to live happily ever after. And when that didn't happen, don't get me wrong, I know that, the relationship issues were before that. But often in circumstances where relationships aren't necessarily going the way they were expected, sometimes people will look at certain events to quote unquote fix things. So if you had a relationship that was okay but had its issues, you get married. Okay, now everything's going to be better. But you're still married and things aren't going the way that you planned. Okay, we'll have a kid and it'll get better. But you're still having issues and everything, and it's like, all right, well, I'm just saying there are things that people do sometimes, create life events that they think are going to just fix everything because they're going to be magical moments that are going to last in perpetuity, but clearly they don't.
Yeah, so your marriage is messed up, kid's not going to improve it. In many cases, it actually exacerbates the problem.
So let's think about this. You have a situation where you have someone like Scott Summers, along with Jean Grey, who have already had their own rocky stuff going on, now taking care of a kid in the future that they know but no, that wasn't Jean Grey because that was someone, but that was because she looked, but then, oh, wow.
I'm just envisioning like Austin Powers, and now I've gone cross-eyed because that's what it comes down to. Again, Please don't try to think about it too much. So the last thing that last, I guess, issue that we'll get into is the issue of control over his powers and the trauma. And I find it telling that in all versions of the story in which he does not have control over his powers, it's all based on trauma, whether it's the physical or it's the emotional. The constant throughout all of this is that something is preventing Scott from having full control of his powers, and he can control his powers, but for this terrible thing that's happened to him, if only he could overcome it. And I think that's telling because I think in many ways that's incredibly relatable to us as people, that we are our own worst enemies. And God knows I am. And I've been telling myself that and hearing that from, family and teachers and friends and loved ones my entire life, that I am my own worst enemy. And I think every one of us is, for the most part, that we can all overcome things if we just learn how to deal with our mess, for lack of a better, more profane term. Deal with your mess and you can move on and you can progress past that. Scott can never quite seem to get there. Everything is always someone else's fault. Everything is the trauma. Everything is always something that he can't deal with or he won't deal with. Doc, if you will.
Okay. I'll start with the physical one because that was the first one introduced. So it's true. If you have a traumatic brain injury, there is a chance that certain functions are not going to work properly. That's just the way it is. It's terrible. It's tragic, but that doesn't mean that quality of life has to diminish to the point that you just give up on your goals.
Yeah, it was the famous story about, I forget his name, the man with the railroad spike driven through his...
Phineas Gage.
Phineas Gage, thank you. I knew it was Phineas. I was going to say Phineas Fogg. No, that was Around the World in 80 Days. Phineas Gage, very famous story, and we'll include that in the show notes. Had the railroad spike driven through his face, survived, but wasn't the same. And doctors did studies on him and determined that something must have impacted his brain, and studies on personality and those things. So at least in the original telling of the story, that could be one excuse or explanation for Scott.
Right. And the thing with that, of course, is, if you have something where a part of his brain is affected, probably something involving the optic system, where he can't control these blasts. Okay, you know what? That is a serious problem. They got it through with the, ruby quartz glasses and the ruby quartz shield and all of that, to the point, okay, you have the ability to control it now. So that's not an excuse. Like, yes, in theory, you want something, I'm sure he wishes he could just do it on his own if we're going by that original story, but he can't. So don't cry over spilled milk. Don't worry about it. You can't switch out, parts of your brain, at least, maybe they can in comics, but I'm just saying the way he's written, that's not the way it's handled. But that's the point. That's the point of the training. That's the point of him dealing with Xavier. That's the point of having the guidance. Yes, you have things that other people don't. What are you going to do with it? How are you going to use it? Is it really going to weigh you down, or is it going to be a blessing? That's all in perspective. And that's something that Charles Xavier did, I think, a fantastic job doing.
Or he tried to, anyway.
Well, yeah.
As we see,
I'm really trying to be positive.
Student didn't really take away all the lessons he was supposed to from the teacher.
That's true. But the point being, all right, something's taken away or things are shifted. You just learn to create ways that you work around it. That's the physical. the psychological version, the psychological variation of him suppressing trauma, I think that's actually way more interesting, because that means that there is something in his particular system of thought that felt that he wasn't ready at the time to handle whatever was going on. We've talked about trauma before with Jessica Jones. We've talked about dissociation with some character. I don't remember exactly. It was Moon Knight, people. If this is your first episode, we did a great episode on Moon Knight, which is Anthony Sitko's favorite character. But that's not my point. My point being, we're not talking dissociation. We're not talking about splitting off reality. We're talking about just literally putting it somewhere in your own mental memory bank that you simply don't access. So he still is who he is. He doesn't segregate it out. He just basically says, don't go there. And no matter what, he won't go there. In this case, why I think it's more interesting, it means that he purposely doesn't want control of an immense ability. Why would he avoid that? Why would he not want to control that? And you already said it, because it's a scapegoat. It's an easy way out. It's an escape hatch. Scott, the world as we know it is coming to an end. We need to do something about it. Yeah, well, I got this plan. Okay, let's do it. Oh, but I can't control my powers too well, so I can't do too much. It's just an easy way. If something goes wrong, he has that to fall back on and blame.
Well, like Jessica Jones, we talked about that, where she didn't ask for these powers, much like Scott didn't ask for the powers. So, the question was raised during the Jessica Jones episode. Why would she willingly suppress or ignore her abilities? And it was that very thing that she didn't ask for it, and she didn't really know how to process it or deal with it. And she didn't have the teaching of someone like a Professor X. She didn't have that mentor figure. Scott did. From a teenager, he had a mentor, and he still can't deal with it. So that's very telling from the notion that someone like Scott can't cope with it, even under ideal or better than most circumstances.
And I'm going to add something that I just remembered. He did have a temporary control thanks to Emma Frost. Emma worked with him on it. And that's how they found out that it was a psychological point. And he still lost the power again to control it, like the quote unquote ability to control it. So he's had tons of opportunity to work on this. And he just says, nope.
Yeah.
You might say it's uncanny. Yeah, I know people. I'm the one doing all the puns this week. I don't know what to tell you. We are who we are.
It happens. I'm not going to knock you for it. So treatment, assuming working with a living Scott Summers, which he is not at present, but let's go back to right before he died. How would you in universe treat it, given that he's literally been in love with two of the greatest telepaths in the Marvel universe and was mentored by the best? So this man is no stranger to analysis, to telepathy, and yet he still is who he is. So I guess my question is, what would you do differently to fix him?
This is going to sound like the opposite of everything I've said up until this point when it comes to avoiding consequences. I do think Beast really hit on something. I think we do have to go back. I think we need to delve into this gap. And what I mean by the gap, I mean foster child before Xavier, literally thrown out of a plane. You got this period of time where everything went wrong. I'm not trying to blame that specifically for everything, because you have to own your decisions throughout life. But if we're going to do the most good for this man, I think it would really behoove us to see if there's any way to have some intervention at that point. And I don't know which characters would be able to assist me in doing that. And I'm not a child psychiatrist by trade, I'll admit that. But I think that at this point, this tree's roots have grown so deep that any other work is incredibly superficial. I do think that he can learn to take more responsibility and be a better leader by seeing other examples of people doing it, maybe not pick Steve Rogers because there's some sort of direct animosity there for obvious reasons. But I do think that if he had more direct mentorship that's not a mutant, I think that would be more powerful, because everybody else has approached this in a way that says, we can help you because we're just like you. I think an outside influence that says, I can't pretend that I have what you have, but I'm willing to try and understand. I think that might have a more powerful impact to him. So if I could reach out to preferably not just even a superhero, like someone that's depowered, that, is kind of C-rate, just trying to connect with him on a personal level, I think that would be more powerful than anything that any of these other people have done.
So Moon Knight then. No, depowered.
I get your point. I get your point.
BC list, and has his own history of dealing with mental issues. Now, I don't know that necessarily Mark Spector is the right person to deal with anybody, especially given everything he's going through now in the comics, which I don't want to get into that. This last issue was a real doozy.
Oh, boy.
I don't even know why I'm still buying it. The completist in me has to, but I don't want to. But somebody like that, I think, could talk to him and at the very least make him realize, he's got way worse issues than I do, and he still manages to do some good. So maybe I need to quit crying and complaining about my stuff and just focus on getting things done. I think Moon Knight would actually be a very good, now that I'm thinking it and talking it out loud, I think he would make a very good mentor for Scott Summers, because Scott would point to him. It's like a, guilty pleasure, and you watch a show like, I don't know, Jersey Shore or something, and you're like, oh man, I got problems in my life, but at least I'm not that, Yeah. At least I'm not on 600 Pound Life or X on the Beach or whatever those horrible reality shows that my wife likes to watch. God. So out of universe, someone with the ego, lack of concern and regard for, I don't want to say he's misogynistic, but the level of disregard for how he treats other people, and someone who projects and blames others or other problems for their trauma and their issues in life. How do you deal with someone going through that?
There are plenty of examples of people that have made these types of decisions in life. I'm not going to name specific people. That's not fair to them, especially if they're working on whatever it is they need to work on. However, I will name someone that I think is a good example of, despite I'm sure people are going to think this is controversial and it's not meant to be, someone like Tony Robbins. Like, if you actually know what Tony Robbins' backstory is, what he went through as a child and all the things he had to overcome, I mean...
Well, I went to a UPW seminar, so I know full well, because I had it spoken and / yelled at me for 4 or 5 days. All right. Because Tony Robbins is not a quiet man.
Okay. And it doesn't, and don't get me wrong, I'm not saying you have to pay for a guru. I'm not saying you have to buy a bunch of books and all that.
There's a Netflix documentary on him. So if you have Netflix, I am not your guru, but it's all about Tony Robbins.
No, my point with this is, though, that it's obvious that if you have points of being a boss, of being a leader, and you have aspirations to do that, try and find the people in your life that are going to influence you the right way. And there's been plenty of research on this in terms of circle of influence. You take on the traits of the people that are closest to you and the people that you decide to associate with. So when you have someone who is basically trying to shirk responsibility and trying to blame everyone around them and is, not exactly putting as much effort as they should into relationships, well, then I start looking at who else are they dealing with? Obviously they're dealing with their spouse, who may or may not have similar traits. They may be dealing with other family members. They may be dealing with friends. And those aren't people that you can just change, in the blink of an eye, or in Cyclops' case, maybe he could. But the point being, there are other ways to get those people involved. You can see a professional that doesn't know every bit of your story, and they can point out the flaws. And I apologize if this sounds like a sales pitch. It's not meant to. You can read about people that you think have the traits that you have, but are doing it better than you are, and make them your mentor, even if they don't know you. This is a healthy way to do it. I'm not talking stalking, you know? What you're doing right now, people, you're listening to podcasts. Most of the people, we don't know who you are, except, you know, hi, Tony's mom. Hi, Brian. I'm just saying, you're getting influenced by outside information from people you don't know. And nowadays, it's easier than ever to do. So if you can find the positive people that are influencing your life and make them the crux of how you're going to continue to live your life, you're going to get some pretty good results. It doesn't just have to be this bubble, this isolation of the things that you already knew and the things that you're running away from.
Well, the key to that, I think, is the desire and the willingness to grow and change, and the understanding that you may not know it all, because the flip side to that is the crabs in a bucket mentality, where you look at the people that are more successful than you look at the people that are greater than you and where you want to be. And rather than say, what are they doing and how can I get to where they are? You go, how can I bring them down to my level? Because it's a lot easier to break down than it is to build up. And that's just a fact of life and entropy and nature, that it's going to be a lot easier to tear people down, and it's a lot faster to tear people down than it is to build them up. So you just have to be careful, and you have to come at it from a good place, that if you're going to model someone's behavior or look at them as a role model, you know, you have to be honest about yourself, and you have to be willing to say, these are the things that I know that I need to fix and change about myself, and then be willing to do the work, and then be willing to actually admit fault and grow and say, okay, this is what they did. This is what I haven't been doing, and go for the results and not make excuses. You know, results, not excuses is one of my life mantras. I have RNE tattooed on the inside of my wrist, and I remind myself every once in a while I literally would just look at my wrist and remind myself, I tattooed this on myself for a reason, because I lose sight sometimes of the end game. And I get too hung up on, well, this didn't go my way or that didn't go my way. Okay, they didn't. But what are you going to do next? You can get results. You can make excuses. You can't do both. So that kind of boils it down. And I think that, like I said, as long as you come at it from a positive mindset and be willing to accept your flaws and address them and move from them, you can grow and you can learn.
Absolutely.
So with all of that being said, I don't know if you need a ruby quartz room or block before you meet with your next patient, Doc?
I'd like to think at this point that Scott's got that covered. Literally, I think he's got it covered.
Womp womp. So we now see what happens when Scott Summers, Cyclops, sits on Dr. Issues' couch.
Hello, Scott. I'm Dr. Issues.
Hello, Doctor. Are you here to fix me?
Oh, boy. Okay, since this is our first interaction, I'd like to think that we can be civil and more cordial than that.
Well, forgive me if I don't jump at the opportunity to work with a human who thinks they can understand my struggles, but I've seen how your kind works when they think they know what's best.
Are you certain you want to go down this road with someone like me?
I acknowledge your people have suffered at the hands of oppressors, but...
Look, so can we leave that at the door and just talk man to man, okay? Look, the entire universe doesn't have to be a part of this conversation.
Fair enough.
So, Scott, okay, how can I help you accomplish your goals in a healthy manner?
Well, if you can speak for all mankind and get them to understand that mutants are not inherently a danger to society, that'd go a long way. Otherwise, we're just spinning our wheels.
In that case, maybe we can figure this out together. Look, I'm not going to pretend I have all the answers. As long as you don't pretend either.
Okay, Doc. I'm listening.
Look, you wonder why people become afraid of things they don't understand? Look, somehow I don't think responding to that fear with anger and disgust is really going to move the needle. Okay, you've done that so many times. Come on, man, there's got to be a different way.
I hope so. And many have tried before me. But when the needle is moving towards your neck, sometimes anger and disgust is the only way to protect yourself. Having said that, I'm open to a dialogue, an open and honest one, as long as all parties have good intentions.
Okay. Then can you give me a plan for what that looks like?
Give me some time. I'll get back to you with some suggestions at our next meeting.
Next meeting? Okay, so does that mean you trust me?
We're not there yet, but we are on the road.
You know what? I can respect that.
And I can respect you, Doc. See you next time.
That kind of got a little deeper than I thought it would.
No, I mean, listen, it is what it is. And I think we established a long time ago that mutants were kind of the 60s allegory for racism. So the fact that you've got, a mutant talking to a black man about their mutual struggles, I don't really think, as he said, subtlety has kind of had its day. Some points need to be made blatantly and obviously.
Yeah, that's true. And sometimes the best thing that any person can do in a situation like that is listen.
Yeah, listening definitely helps. We have 2 ears and 1 mouth for a reason. It means we should listen twice as often as we speak. At least that's what my teachers always tried to tell me. I don't know how often it worked because I never shut up, but I think I try to do a better job of listening, certainly now than I used to.
Well, I'm going to completely ignore your hyperverbal disorder, and yes, I made that up. And let's see how we end this episode.
It's funny because people always assume that I talk a lot because I love the sound of my own voice. And given that I worked in radio and I have a podcast, I'm actually not that enamored with it. But it's more the belief in having to say what it is that I need to say rather than some romanticized version of, well, as long as I'm speaking, I must be intelligent. It's just more of a deeper rooted thing than that, I guess. I don't know. I hope maybe. Is any of this making sense? I don't know. Let me know. Let us know. I guess it's a good point as any to segue. We've got our Facebook page. We've got a Twitter account. We've got an email address, capesonthecouch@gmail.com. You can go to our website, capesonthecouch.live, where you can download all of our shows and episodes. And you can comment and interact with us. We've got a Patreon. You can find our show on iTunes, Google Play, Stitcher, TuneIn, YouTube, and iHeartRadio. What else? I think that's basically all the methods of communication and ways that you can interact with us. Next week's episode, thanks to our president, Brian, has selected Legion. So we're going to do that. And the episode is going to drop next Wednesday, the day after the Legion 2 season finale. I have never seen the show, but I feel like I need to do a lot of watching between now and next week so I can at least talk. Maybe I may not be able to get through all of seasons 1 and 2, but I'm going to try to at least get through season 1.
Thank you, Brian, for giving us the best homework ever.
Yeah, seriously. And really cool equipment to work on it too. So we will discuss that. And of course, Brian, if you have any questions about Legion, let us know. You got my number and you talk to me every day. So what? Come on. He's one of my best friends. You know him too. Yes. I talk to him all the time. So he's going to let me know what the situation is with Legion if he has any given particular questions that he wants me to answer about him. And then the following week, we're going to move do the question. So we were going to do the question after Cyclops. Brian wants Legion. So we'll do Legion and then we'll do the question, which means I get to watch Justice League Unlimited. So again, no complaints about my homework. Doc, anything you want to add before we leave?
I wonder what would have happened if Legion were on that airplane instead of Scott Summers, because with that parachute, he would have been Legion Air.
No. Just no. On that horrible pun, we're going to leave before Dr. Issues says something else stupid that gives me an aneurysm. For Dr. Issues, I'm Anthony Sitko. Thank you so much. We'll see you next week.
Capes on the Couch podcast is for entertainment purposes only. Dr. Issues is a psychiatrist, but he is not your psychiatrist and does not have knowledge of your individual situation. For any personal mental health concerns, please consult your own healthcare providers. For medical emergencies, please call 911 or the designated number in your area immediately. Remember that you are not alone and help is out there.